When Michael Carter walked into Maple Grove Restaurant for the first time, he wasn't looking for problems. He was looking for opportunities. At least, that was how he described it. As Regional Operations Director for Heritage Dining Group, Michael spent most of his time traveling between restaurants across the country. His job was simple: find inefficiencies, fix them, increase profits, move on. For nearly 15 years, that approach had worked remarkably well. Underperforming locations became profitable, costs decreased, service became faster, customer complaints fell. Michael wasn't flashy. He wasn't arrogant. He simply believed that every business problem could be solved if you looked closely enough at the numbers. And numbers, in his experience, rarely lied. The assignment that brought him to Maple Grove Restaurant seemed straightforward. The restaurant wasn't losing money. Far from it. It was surviving on a high level. But according to Heritage Dining Group's newest owner, surviving was no longer enough. 3 months earlier, 32-year-old Ethan Reynolds had inherited the restaurant chain from his father. The company operated more than 40 locations across several states. Some performed exceptionally well. Others struggled. Ethan had ambitious plans: modernization, expansion, efficiency, growth. And Michael Carter had become one of the key people responsible for making those plans a reality. Maple Grove was one of the locations on his list. The restaurant itself looked pleasant enough: warm lighting, comfortable booths, a welcoming atmosphere. The kind of place families visited after soccer games. The kind of place retired couples chose for lunch. The kind of place where regular customers seemed to know each other by name. Michael parked his car across the street and studied the building for a moment. Nothing appeared unusual. Nothing appeared broken. But experience had taught him that the biggest problems rarely announced themselves. They hid inside routines, inside habits, inside traditions that nobody questioned anymore. Lunch rush was beginning when he stepped inside. Customers occupied most of the booths. Servers moved between tables. Conversations filled the room. At first glance, everything appeared normal. Then Michael noticed an elderly waitress carrying a tray toward a booth near the windows. She couldn't have been younger than 65, maybe older. Her gray hair was neatly pinned back. A small notebook rested in her apron pocket. And unlike every other server in the restaurant, she wasn't moving quickly. Michael watched as she stopped beside a table occupied by an older couple. The couple smiled immediately. The waitress smiled back. Then something strange happened. Instead of taking their order, she sat down. Actually sat down. At the table. The three of them talked. For nearly 2 minutes. Michael checked his watch. Then checked again. 2 minutes became 3. Meanwhile, other customers continued arriving. Other servers rushed past. The lunch crowd grew larger. Yet the waitress remained seated, chatting comfortably. Michael frowned. Interesting. Then she stood. The couple laughed at something she said. She wrote something in her notebook and headed toward the kitchen. Michael continued watching. Throughout the next hour, the same pattern repeated itself, over and over again. Customers greeted her by name. She greeted them by name. Sometimes she knew their usual order before they spoke. Sometimes conversations lasted longer than the actual transaction. And somehow, despite all of that, nobody seemed impatient. Quite the opposite. People seemed delighted whenever she approached. Michael eventually asked a nearby employee, "Who is she?" The young hostess glanced across the room. "Oh, that's Eleanor." "Eleanor?" "Eleanor Brooks." The hostess smiled. "She's been here forever." Forever Michael thought, was usually a warning sign. How long exactly? The hostess shrugged. More than 30 years, I think. 30 years. Michael made a mental note. Long tenure wasn't necessarily a problem, but it often came with resistance to change. And change was exactly why he had been sent here. Later that afternoon, Michael sat in the manager's office reviewing payroll reports. One name immediately caught his attention. Eleanor Brooks. Age, 68. Years employed, 32. Hourly wage, highest among all servers. Benefits package, full. Vacation accrual, extensive. Michael leaned back in his chair. There it was. The first opportunity. Not because Eleanor was doing anything wrong. Not because she wasn't working hard. But because businesses had to evolve. Customers were changing. Technology was changing. The industry was changing. And every successful restaurant had to adapt. At least, that was what the numbers always suggested. Outside the office window, Eleanor crossed the dining room carrying a coffee refill for a customer. Halfway there, she stopped. The customer said something. Eleanor laughed. The customer laughed. And for a brief moment, the interaction looked less like a business transaction and more like two old friends sharing a conversation. Michael looked away. Friendship wasn't a metric. Conversation wasn't a metric. Relationships weren't a metric. The numbers were the metrics. And according to the numbers, Maple Grove Restaurant still had plenty of room for improvement. What Michael didn't realize was that he had already identified the most important person in the entire restaurant. The only problem was that he had completely misunderstood why. Over the next weeks, Michael did exactly what Heritage Dining Group had hired him to do. He observed, he measured, and he changed things. Some of the changes were obvious improvements. The restaurant's outdated reservation system was replaced with a modern digital platform. Scheduling became more efficient. Inventory waste decreased. Kitchen communication improved. Service times became faster. Even the local manager admitted that many of Michael's suggestions were helping. By the end of the second week, operating costs had already begun to decline. Head office was pleased. Michael was pleased. And most importantly, the numbers were pleased. At least the numbers Michael was tracking. Every evening he updated spreadsheets. Labor costs. Food costs. Average ticket times. Table turnover. Payroll efficiency. The reports looked better every week. One afternoon, while reviewing service data, Michael noticed something else. The average server at Maple Grove handled nearly 30% more tables per hour than Eleanor. 30%. He stared at the figure for several seconds. That wasn't a small difference. It was significant. He opened another report. Then another. The pattern repeated itself. Eleanor consistently served fewer tables, spent more time with each customer, and generated fewer transactions per hour. On paper, it was difficult to justify. Michael wasn't looking for reasons to criticize her. In fact, he genuinely liked her. Everyone liked Eleanor. Customers liked her as much as the other employees liked her. Managers liked her. Even Michael found her impossible to dislike. She greeted everyone warmly, remembered names effortlessly, and somehow managed to make every conversation feel important. But business decisions couldn't be based on popularity. At least that was what Michael believed. One afternoon he watched Eleanor approach an elderly man seated alone in a corner booth. The restaurant was busy. Several tables needed attention. Yet Eleanor pulled out a chair and sat down beside him. The man smiled. Then he began talking. Michael couldn't hear the conversation, but he could see the man's expression changing. At first tired, then engaged, then genuinely happy. Nearly 5 minutes passed. 5 minutes. To Michael, 5 minutes represented opportunity cost. 5 minutes meant delayed service elsewhere. 5 minutes meant fewer customers served. 5 minutes meant lower productivity. When Eleanor finally stood and returned to work, Michael shook his head. Good intentions. Bad business. Or so he thought. Later that evening, he met with Olivia Chen, the restaurant's assistant manager. Olivia had worked at Maple Grove for nearly 8 years. She was intelligent, organized, and unusually honest. Michael appreciated that. Eleanor seems very popular, he said. Olivia smiled. That's one way to describe her. Michael closed a report folder. She's spending a lot of time with customers. Olivia nodded. She always has. Has anyone ever tried to reduce that? The smile disappeared. Why would we? Michael leaned forward. Because we are running a restaurant. Olivia studied him for a moment, then chose her words carefully. Customers like talking to her. Of course they do. No, Olivia said quietly. You don't understand. Michael waited. Eleanor knows everyone. Lots of servers know regular customers. Olivia shook her head. Not like Eleanor. Michael remained unconvinced. Every restaurant believed it had one irreplaceable employee. In his experience, that was rarely true. People retired. People moved away. Businesses adapted. Life continued. Nobody was truly indispensable. That had always been his belief. Meanwhile, the improvements continued. By the beginning of the 3rd month, Michael's reports looked better than ever. Food waste was down. Labor costs were down. Operating margins were improving. The regional vice president congratulated him during a conference call. Several board members specifically mentioned Maple Grove as a success story. Even Ethan Reynolds took notice. Excellent work, the young owner said during a video meeting. This is exactly the kind of modernization we're looking for. Michael thanked him. After all, the results spoke for themselves. Then something unexpected happened. One Tuesday afternoon, Eleanor called in sick. Nothing serious. Just a seasonal flu. For the first time in years, she missed several consecutive shifts. The restaurant continued operating. No crisis occurred. Customers still arrived. Meals were still served. Business continued as usual. Mostly. 3 days later, Olivia walked into Michael's temporary office, carrying a stack of reports. You might want to look at these. Michael accepted the papers. What am I looking for? Customer counts. Michael scanned the numbers, then frowned. Tuesday was down. Wednesday was down. Thursday was down. Not dramatically, but enough to notice. Weather? He asked. Olivia shrugged. Maybe. Michael checked nearby locations. They showed no similar decline. Interesting. Still, 3 days wasn't enough data to draw conclusions. The following week, Eleanor returned. The customer numbers recovered. Michael barely noticed. The coincidence slipped quietly into the background. A month later, Eleanor took 2 vacation days. Again, the customer count dipped. Again, it recovered when she returned. Everyone noticed. Olivia, the restaurant manager, even several servers noticed. Michael didn't. Because he wasn't looking for that pattern. He was looking elsewhere. at costs, margins, efficiency, the metrics that mattered. Later that week, Michael scheduled a meeting with Eleanor. It wasn't an easy conversation, at least not from his perspective. Eleanor arrived carrying her usual notebook and a cup of tea. She smiled as she entered the office. "You wanted to see me?" Michael gestured toward the chair. "Please, have a seat." Eleanor sat down comfortably. She seemed completely relaxed. That somehow made Michael more uncomfortable. For a moment he considered postponing the discussion. Then he reminded himself why he was there. This was business, not personal. "Eleanor," he began, "first, I want you to know how much everyone appreciates your contribution to this restaurant." She smiled. That smile told him she already knew where the conversation was heading. "We truly value everything you've done here. 32 years, thousands of customers, countless shifts, countless memories." Michael had prepared a speech. Suddenly it sounded less convincing than it had in his head the night before. "You've earned the right to enjoy retirement." There it was. A word. Retirement. Eleanor simply nodded. No surprise. No anger. No argument. Nothing. Michael continued. "We're restructuring several positions." "Of course you are." The answer caught him off guard. "You know that?" Eleanor laughed softly. "Michael, I've worked in this restaurant for 32 years. She took a sip of tea. Every few years somebody arrives with new ideas. There was no bitterness in her voice. Only experience. "You don't seem upset." Eleanor looked toward the dining room through the office window. Customers filled the booths. Servers crossed the floor. The lunch rush was beginning. "It's not my restaurant." She paused. "It's just my turn to help it." For some reason, that sentence stayed with him. Long after the meeting ended. Long after Eleanor stood up. Long after she agreed to finish the month and then retire. At the time, Michael assumed the transition would be smooth. After all, businesses replaced employees every day. Life moved forward. That was reality. The staff organized a farewell dinner during Eleanor's final week. Customers brought flowers, cards, small gifts. One customer drove nearly 2 hours just to thank her in person. Michael attended. He found the turnout impressive, touching, even, but not unusual. People were sentimental, especially when someone retired after 32 years. Then Eleanor Brooks was gone. The restaurant continued operating, exactly as Michael expected. No disaster occurred. No emergency unfolded. The doors opened. Customers arrived. Meals were served. The business survived. For the first few weeks, everything appeared normal. Then came the quarterly review meeting. Michael entered Heritage Dining Group's boardroom feeling confident. The previous quarter had been one of his strongest. An impressive number of locations showed improved margins. Labor efficiency was up. Food waste was down. Payroll costs had been reduced. The presentation looked excellent. The kind of presentation executives enjoy presenting, and board members enjoy hearing. At the far end of the table sat Ethan Reynolds. Young, ambitious, determined to modernize the company his father had built. Michael respected him. Ethan asked difficult questions, but they were usually the right questions. The meeting began. Location after location appeared on the large screen. Operating costs, profit margins, efficiency metrics. Everything looked promising. Then Maple Grove Restaurant appeared. Michael smiled. This was one of his greater success stories. A textbook example of operational improvement. Labor costs down. Service times improved. Waste reduced. Exactly what the company wanted. Then one of the analysts cleared her throat. There's one issue. Michael looked up. The analyst changed slides. The room became quiet. Customer visits. Down. Not dramatically, but noticeably. The analyst clicked again. Repeat visits. Down. Average customer spending. Down. Customer loyalty participation. Down. The room remained silent. Michael frowned. That didn't make sense. The restaurant had become more efficient. Service was faster. Operations were cleaner. Costs were lower. Why would customers spend less? Why would fewer customers return? Ethan leaned forward. How long has this trend been developing? The analyst checked her notes. Approximately 3 months. 3 months. Michael's stomach tightened. The same period during which Eleanor had retired. Coincidence. Probably coincidence. Yet the timing was impossible to ignore. The analyst clicked again. A graph appeared. The decline wasn't dramatic. That was the frightening part. It was gradual, steady, like a slow leak in a tire. Easy to miss, until suddenly you realize you're no longer moving forward. One board member frowned. Any explanation? Nobody answered. Another board member studied the graph. Customer spending is falling faster than customer count. Yes, the analyst replied. They're still visiting, but spending less, and staying less. The room fell silent again. Michael stared at the numbers. For the first time, something felt wrong. Not with the restaurant, with his assumptions. Ethan broke the silence. What changed at Maple Grove? The question sounded simple. Michael knew the answer immediately, yet he didn't want to say it, because saying it would make the possibility real. Finally, he cleared his throat. One long-term employee retired. Nobody reacted. The statement sounded insignificant. One employee, out of dozens. One retirement. Nothing unusual. Yet Michael couldn't stop looking at the graph. For the first time in his career, he found himself wondering whether the most expensive mistake he had ever made wasn't visible in any spreadsheet. Because spreadsheets could measure payroll. They could measure food costs. They could measure efficiency. But perhaps there were things happening inside that restaurant that no report had ever captured. And if that was true, Michael suddenly had a very uncomfortable investigation ahead of him. The following Monday, Michael returned to Maple Grove Restaurant. Not as an executive. Not as a problem solver. Not as a man carrying answers. For the first time in years, he arrived carrying questions. The lunch crowd was smaller than he remembered. Not dramatically smaller. Just enough to feel different. Several booths sat empty. The dining room still looked welcoming. The food was still good. The service was still efficient. Yet something felt missing. Michael couldn't quite identify what it was. At first, he spent the day observing, listening, watching. This time he ignored the spreadsheets, ignored reports, ignored metrics. Instead, he watched people. By mid-afternoon, he noticed something unusual. Customers kept asking the same question. Not about menu items. Not about prices. The same question. Again and again. How's Eleanor doing? The first time, Michael barely noticed. The second time, he paid attention. The fifth time, he became curious. By the 10th time, He became concerned. One elderly man asked. A young mother asked. A retired couple asked. Even a college student asked. The question crossed generations. Different customers. Different lives. Same concern. How's Eleanor? That evening Michael sat with Olivia. How often does that happen? Olivia looked confused. The questions? About Eleanor. Olivia laughed softly. Every day. Every day. Michael stared at her. Every day? She nodded. Sometimes more than once an hour. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Michael asked, Why? Olivia leaned back. Then she smiled. Because she cared. Michael frowned. Lots of employees care. Olivia shook her head. No. She pointed toward the dining room. Most employees care about customers. Then she pointed toward the entrance. Eleanor cared about people. The distinction seemed small. It wasn't. Over the next several days, Michael started having conversations. Real conversations. The kind he usually didn't have time for. A retired firefighter named Frank sat in booth 3 every Thursday. For years. Michael introduced himself. Frank smiled. Then immediately asked if Eleanor was doing well. Michael laughed despite himself. Everyone asks that. Frank nodded. Of course they do. What made her so special? The older man looked genuinely surprised by the question, as though the answer should have been obvious. 5 years ago, I had surgery. Michael waited. Eleanor called every week. Michael blinked. Called? Frank nodded. Just to check on me. Silence. Eleanor isn't family. Frank smiled. No. Then he looked around the restaurant. But sometimes family isn't the only people who care. A few days later, Michael spoke with Linda, a widow who came every Tuesday. Always the same booth. Always the same soup. Always the same tea. Eleanor helped me after my husband died. Michael nodded politely. Then Linda continued. For 6 months. His expression changed. 6 months? Linda smiled. I wasn't easy to help. Michael laughed. I believe that. So did Eleanor. The widow's eyes softened. She never tried to fix anything. Then what did she do? Linda looked toward the empty booth across from her. She remembered to ask. The answer stayed with him. She remembered to ask. Not complicated. Not expensive. Not measurable. Yet somehow priceless. The stories continued. One customer met his business partner through Eleanor. Another discovered a volunteer opportunity. A third found a support group after losing a spouse. One young couple had their first date at Maple Grove because Eleanor introduced them. They were married now. Michael began hearing the same story repeatedly. Different details. Different people. Same pattern. Eleanor connected people. The restaurant had never been just a restaurant. It had been a community. And Eleanor had quietly maintained that community for more than 3 decades. Without recognition. Without awards. Without titles. Without anyone realizing how valuable her work truly was. Including Michael. Especially Michael. 2 weeks later, he drove to Eleanor's home. A small house. Well-kept garden. Wind chimes on the porch. Nothing remarkable. And yet somehow it felt exactly right. Eleanor opened the door. She looked neither surprised nor upset. Almost as though she had expected him. Hello, Michael. Hello, Eleanor. She stepped aside. Coffee? Michael laughed. Please. A few minutes later, they sat at her kitchen table. The same table where Eleanor had probably shared thousands of ordinary conversations over the years. Michael finally took a deep breath. I owe you an apology. Eleanor stirred her coffee. Probably. The answer made him laugh. Then, surprisingly, it made him relax. For the first time since the board meeting, he felt able to speak honestly. I thought I understood the restaurant. You understood part of it. Michael nodded. Not enough. Eleanor smiled. No. A long silence followed. Not uncomfortable. Just thoughtful. Finally, Michael said, I measured everything. Eleanor nodded. I know. I still missed the most important thing. This time, Eleanor didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked out the kitchen window, then back at Michael. You weren't measuring the wrong things. Michael frowned. I wasn't. No. She shook her head. You just weren't measuring enough things. That sentence hit harder than any criticism, because it was true. Payroll mattered. Efficiency mattered. Margins mattered. The mistake wasn't caring about numbers. The mistake was believing that numbers told the whole story. Several weeks later, Michael stood before Ethan Reynolds and the board. For once, he wasn't presenting a success story. He was presenting a lesson. The room remained unusually quiet as he explained everything he had discovered. The customer interviews, the relationships, the declining loyalty, the stories, the impact of one employee. When he finished, nobody spoke for several moments. Finally, Ethan leaned back, then smiled. Interesting. Michael laughed. Interesting? Ethan nodded. You spent months trying to improve efficiency and accidentally discovered our competitive advantage. The room laughed. Michael did too, because Ethan was right. The company had spent years discussing customer loyalty, brand identity, community engagement. Yet one waitress had quietly accomplished all three without ever attending a strategy meeting. Then came the proposal. Michael spent nearly 20 minutes explaining it. When he finished, the room erupted into discussion, not because they disliked the idea, because they loved it. A month later, Michael drove back to Eleanor's house, this time carrying a proposal approved by the board, a proposal everyone hoped she would accept. Eleanor, we'd like you to train future managers. No. Michael blinked. You haven't even heard the proposal. I heard enough. Eleanor. No. Michael sighed. This was going exactly as he feared. Why? Eleanor shrugged. People think training happens in conference rooms. Silence. They sit in chairs. Pause. They watch slides. Pause. They nod. Another pause. Then they go back to doing exactly what they were doing before. Michael couldn't argue. Because she wasn't wrong. So what do you suggest? Eleanor thought for a moment, then smiled. Send them here. Here? Maple Grove. To the restaurant? Where else? Within months, promising employees from across the chain began arriving. Young managers, assistant managers, future leaders, all expecting presentations, manuals, PowerPoint slides. Instead, Eleanor handed them aprons. One trainee looked confused. When does the training begin? Eleanor smiled. You're wearing it. Over the following year, dozens of future managers passed through Maple Grove. They learned how to remember names, how to notice people, how to listen, how to build trust, how to make customers feel seen. One trainee finally asked the question everyone eventually asked. How do you remember all these customers? Eleanor smiled. The answer was simple. I don't remember customers. She looked around the dining room. I remember people. 1 year later, Michael stood once again before the board. This time the numbers told a different story. Customer loyalty up. Repeat visits up. Revenue per customer up. Employee retention up. The company had become more profitable, but more importantly, it had become more human. One director asked the obvious question, "What changed?" Ethan Reynolds smiled, then glanced toward Michael. "We stopped measuring transactions." A brief pause, and started measuring relationships. That afternoon, back at Maple Grove Restaurant, Eleanor watched a young trainee greet a regular customer by name, ask about his granddaughter, remember his usual order, then introduce him to another customer sitting alone nearby. A conversation began. A friendship began. And so, without anyone noticing, the culture Eleanor had spent 32 years building continued into another generation. Eleanor smiled. She didn't need recognition. She didn't need applause. For the first time, she had something better. Successors. People who understood. People who would continue the work long after she was gone. Some businesses survive because of what they sell. The best ones survive because of how they make people feel.